It is entitled This World, This Life, A Humanistic Approach to Religious Traditions.
Well, I want to start with a joke about secularism that says something about religion. You're familiar with the writer and the actor and director Woody Allen? Woody Allen told a story once that he had dated a Catholic woman, but in the end the relationship foundered. He was a secular Jew, she was a lapsed Catholic. They couldn't agree what religion to not raise the kids. Now, skeptics have been challenging religion going back to Greek philosophy and the biblical books of Job and Ecclesiastes, questioning divine justice. I'm a humanistic rabbi, which means I am both a humanist and I'm part of a long Jewish religious tradition. How do I have a foot in both worlds? Well, I want to demonstrate that with the example of the holiday of Hanukkah. Probably familiar with the traditional story of Hanukkah, that the Maccabees fought back against Greeks imposing Greek religion. They achieved a great victory with divine assistance, and that divine assistance was proven because of the miracle of the light. They had enough oil only to last for one day, but it lasted for 8 days. Now, I want to give you 4 reasons to be skeptical of that traditional story. The first is that the story of the oil doesn't actually show up for many centuries after the Maccabees. The Maccabees wrote their own book called the Books of Maccabees that were preserved in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, which becomes the Old Testament. It wasn't preserved by Jews, actually, for a long time. And in the book of Maccabees, there's no mention of a miracle of the oil. If you read the historian Josephus, who wrote a couple centuries after the Maccabees, there's no mention of the miracle of the oil. If you read the Mishnah, which is the first collection of rabbinic teachings dating to around 200 of the Common Era, there's no mention of the miracle of the oil. It isn't until the Talmud, which is written between, say, 300 to 500 of the Common Era, that you find this story of the miracle of the light there. So why did the rabbis that put the Talmud together come up with this story of the miracle of the light? Or they were the first ones to write it down after all those centuries where it had only been word of mouth. Well, that's less likely than they made it up. Why did they write this down now? Well, it shifts the meaning of the story. Instead of focusing on the Maccabees' military victory, it's now changing the benefit, the credit. Who gets the credit? Not the Maccabees. Now, because of the miracle of the light, the credit is given to a god. It also de-emphasizes that militarism of the Maccabees, because the rabbis in the Talmud are writing after a series of terrible, disastrous Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire, and so they want to de-emphasize military fighting and re-emphasize piety and praying for deliverance. So that shifts the story by adding the miracle of the light story. It also helps to explain why Hanukkah was a relatively minor Jewish holiday until the last couple hundred years. The reason is competition. You might know of another holiday that happens at the end of the year. There was no tradition of giving gifts on Hanukkah until you're competing with Christmas. So Hanukkah becomes elevated as a more important holiday because of the surrounding culture. For the rabbis, it was a minor holiday. In the divisions of the Mishnah and the Talmud, these early collections of rabbinic law, there's no separate section on Hanukkah. The details about Hanukkah you find there are thrown in one section on Shabbat, which is related to lighting candles, and another section on brachot, on blessings, because they have to decide what blessing do they put on this tradition. So that's one reason to be skeptical, because the oil story doesn't show up for a long time. The second reason to be skeptical of this classic narrative is that it's not like all the Jews were Maccabees and all the Greeks were imposing this from outside. There were plenty of Jews who themselves were interested in Greek culture. In fact, the first person killed in the Maccabee revolt, according to the books of Maccabees, was a Jewish person who was sacrificing to the Greek gods. So evidently there were some other Jews who were on the Greek side. It wasn't just all Jews on one side, the Greeks on the other. We know this from a lot of other evidence as well. I mentioned the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That happens in 200 BCE. It's done because the Hebrew schools in Alexandria were not very good, and people couldn't understand the Hebrew Bible. They needed a translation for themselves. They translated the Bible into Greek because those Jews were already integrated into Greek culture. Another detail for that is that the generic word for a heretic in rabbinic Judaism is apikoros. Now, if you know anything about Greek philosophy, apikoros sounds a little bit like Epicurus, who's a wonderful secular philosopher that says don't pay attention to the gods, focus on this life, live a good life here and now. It's a wonderfully secular philosophy, and the fact that enough Jews liked Epicurus that the rabbis made apikoros, the word for heretic, in Jewish life shows some affinity back in that time period. The Maccabees were really fundamentalists imposing their version of Judaism. When they found uncircumcised Jewish men, because their parents had chosen not to circumcise the babies, they forcibly circumcised them as they were traveling around. They even conquered another people called the Idumeans and forcibly converted, including forcibly circumcised them too. So if I were to choose, if I had a time machine and went back to that time period, I may well be a more Hellenistic Jew than a Maccabean Jew, because they were the fundamentalist Taliban of their era. Now, a third challenge or skepticism for this story is that the book of the Maccabees claims the date for the dedication of the temple when they cleaned it out. The word for dedication, by the way, in Hebrew is Hanukkah. That's where the name comes from. Was at the same time the Greeks were defiling the temple. In other words, the Greeks defiled it in this season, and we are rededicating it in this season. It could be the Greeks had some kind of winter festival they were observing. It could even be, one theory is that this was a celebration of the birthday of the Greek king Antiochus IV. So the irony is that Jews are still celebrating Antiochus' birthday, complete with candles, but there's no more Antiochus anymore. So maybe that's a root of the story and a root of the holiday. And finally, you know of any other cultures that light fires when it gets dark out? Not just the Christian, candles on the tree, which comes from a pagan tradition, but also Hindus' Diwali festival occurs as the light is getting shorter and shorter. There's a Shinto fire festival. The Romans had a fire festival. It's just a common human phenomenon that people need more light when it gets dark out. It's a human response to the human experience. So what should skeptical Jewish people who have these questions about the traditional story, what should they do in December? Should they grumble louder as the Christmas music gets louder and louder? Should they take their kids to sit on Santa's lap and just be part of the surrounding culture? Do they lean in on the winter solstice and focus on that? Or maybe more secularized, or we use the phrase in our movement, humanistic Jews, can find positive elements of their heritage and their culture that they can celebrate with what we call philosophical integrity. This is our people's version of responding to the need for light and warmth. We can talk about values of giving gifts and not just receiving gifts. One thing that my family's done is, you may be aware of an organization called Kiva, which gives microloans to people in the developing world so they can generate self-sufficiency. So we have a Hanukkah night where, as a family, we get together, we look at some profiles, we take some of the loans that have been paid back, we reallocate it, give a little more money too. But that's a way of giving and not receiving, thinking about that dynamic instead of just the give me more stuff dynamic. You can also focus on the foods that are traditional to this holiday, because who doesn't like things fried in oil? Whether it's potato latkes or a jelly donut from the Middle Eastern Jewish world called sufganiyot. They're celebrating that family heritage and culture, but also doing so in a way that's very tasty. And we can also explore the challenges of fighting for one's own freedom without restricting the freedom of others. After all, if Thomas Jefferson was both a pioneering free thinker and a slaveholder, we can have a complicated relationship with the Maccabees, who are more skeptical Jews. The key point is that if people created religious holidays and traditions to meet human needs, then people today can recreate and adapt them to meet our needs through our values. Think of the Passover Seder that takes place in the spring. There are literally thousands of different Haggadot, or books that are read on Passover, reflecting different values and traditions and approaches to it. There's not only the one traditional version, there are thousands out there from feminist perspectives, from secular perspectives, from LGBTQ inclusive perspectives, and all of them are taking that tradition and finding ways to adapt it to modern needs and modern values. We can also, in those holidays, not only adapt the tradition, but even tell the stories again. The stories didn't have to actually happen to be valuable stories. So we have connecting to your literary heritage. You think about why the story was written, what was the agenda behind it. And you don't have to be threatened by Zeus or Yahweh as a character in the story. It's the story that you're telling, and then you think about character development, writing, authorship, and so on. More broadly, think about in Christian culture, there's a distinction between Christmas and Xmas. For a lot of people, they want to put the Christ back in Christmas. They want to make it very, very religious, when many American Christians celebrate the holiday as a cultural event, a commercial event, a home event. Think about how many people make a nativity scene versus make a Christmas tree. Right? The tree is the holiday tree, The nativity scene is a statement of religious values and the mythology. After all, even the tree itself at one time was a pagan symbol, and it was adapted to Christian context. Even the celebrated atheist scientist Richard Dawkins has a Christmas tree, and explains why, because it's a family tradition and heritage, and he still finds value in those symbols. I do weddings between Jewish and non-Jewish partners all the time, and when I talk about being a cultural Jew and connected to a cultural heritage, it often relates to the Christian partner as well, because they connect with their family history and their family languages, and food, and heritage. It could be an ethnic culture, or it could be even a religious culture. You know, it's the Easter eggs. It doesn't have to be the death and resurrection. So when I ask many Jews, what makes you feel Jewish? Often the answers are not theological beliefs or dietary laws or reciting prayers or ritual practices. Their Jewish identity is an ethnic and cultural identity. So a few follow-up conclusions from that perspective. Like all cultures, Judaism was created by human beings, for human beings. It was a response to the human experience, but it also has human origins, and so that means we're allowed to critique or adapt or change things because it was made by people in the first place. And cultures evolve over time. They change in response to new circumstances and needs, and so too with Jewish life. Like all cultures, Judaism has similarities with other cultures. We have a coming-of-age ceremony, they have a coming-of-age ceremony. But that also means we have distinct features. Jewish culture emphasizes education. We're not the only ones to do it, but other cultures do too. But that is a distinctive feature of Jewish culture. And it's okay to say that my culture is different. You could even say my culture is good. It doesn't mean that you're saying my culture is the best. It's that balance of self-esteem, which is normal and healthy for anybody, without having to claim we're better than everybody else, which is more of this ideology called chosenness. I always laugh when somebody wants to get me you're the number one dad Father's Day card. I always ask, what's your data set? You know, that you've decided that I'm the number one dad. I may be the best dad you've experienced, but how many of you have had? You know, so, but it's to say I'm a good dad or I'm a great dad, that makes sense from their subjective experience. And the same thing is true with cultures. You can have a positive connection with your family, culture, and heritage without having to claim it's the best. Humanists of all varieties approach life with certain core values. Yeah, that's mine right there. Yep. They solve problems and understand reality using evidence and reason. They rely on human knowledge and power to improve the world. They focus on human responsibility and the consequences of what we do to decide what's right and what's wrong. And so this humanistic value approach has affected our humanistic Judaism, because this humanistic value system is our standard for relating to the broad inheritance of Jewish civilization. You can think about inheriting a culture like inheriting your great aunt's attic. There are some things that are beautiful and marvelous that you want to use in your own life. There are other things that might be old and dusty and not necessarily relevant to you. And maybe there's a third category of things that might work in your house if you reframe them or redesign them or fit them to your life. It's all yours that you've inherited. But your house is still your house, and you still get to choose what resonates the most with your life. We're balancing two values, and both are important. We want a sense of continuity with our family tradition and heritage, but we also want the integrity of saying what we believe and not saying what we don't believe, and not living values that aren't ours. Sometimes that means substantial changes in education and celebration, but after all, change, evolution, that's also a part of a Jewish tradition. So sometimes secularized people hear that I'm a humanistic rabbi or hear that I'm part of a humanistic congregation, and they have a couple of objections. They say, why are you using so many religious pieces? The title rabbi, the idea of a congregation, that's all religious. You're not theologically religious, so why are you still using it? I'll give you three basic responses to that. The first is that a religious form may not be the same as religious content. What do you call a leader of a Jewish community who teaches, who helps to organize, who provides counseling and pastoral support for difficult moments, who officiates at ceremonies and holidays, is an expert in Jewish history and identity? Well, if it walks like a rabbi and quacks like a rabbi, I mean, it's filling that need for that population in that community. And there are some advantages provided by that religious form. Community support, it can be nice to have an intellectual on retainer who's available to ask questions. And you have that calendar of the seasons and the life cycle moments that are worth noting. And it also helps to many people to feel rooted in their family heritage, but in a way that speaks to their personal values and beliefs. The second argument I share is that the religious are not the only people with a claim on my inheritance. The Bible, the Talmud, Hebrew language, those are mine too. I've inherited those as much as someone more religious, and they're mine to inherit and adapt, to refashion and recreate, to choose from as I need. It was literature written by people. If you start from the premise that the Bible was written by people, then someone said that God said. I can still learn and accept or reject the teaching that's provided therein, but it was a person that wrote it in the first place, so I'm allowed to agree or disagree, to celebrate or to reject. It's not something from above and beyond, it was from a person. It's all mine, even the stuff I don't like. Think about the flood story, where all these people are wiped out, and even the third kangaroo has to go. Right? And that poor third cow just has to be wiped out. But if people wrote that story, it's reflecting something about the human condition. And have you ever been working on a project and you get so mad at it that you just crumple it up and throw it all away? Of course we do.
Here's a clean set.
Of course we do. It's a temptation. It's a temptation for all of us, and so it's reflecting that even if it's projected into a God doing so. It's literacy in my family's history, and my cultural roots are important. And finally, if religion is an important response to the human experience that shows up again and again, then it must be addressing basic human needs. Who am I? Why am I here? Where do I come from? How can I go through difficult moments? And so if humanism at its essence is responding to human needs, then we have to find ways to answer those questions, those human needs that religion meets. So when a humanistic Jew celebrates Passover, they're celebrating the evolution of that holiday with various foods and songs and questions and answers. They can tell the story of the Exodus, but also explore how that story of the Exodus can be meaningful whether or not it actually happened in history. And there's a lot of evidence that it may not have happened, certainly the way it's described in the Hebrew Bible or the traditional Passover Haggadah. You can also celebrate that story of going from slavery to freedom or from restricted space to free space as part of the human experience of evolving, whether that's coming to the United States or working to make the U.S. a more perfect union that lives up to an updated creed of all people, not just all men being created equal. Or it could be the story of the individual who grows from childhood to maturity, who grows from their parents telling them what to do, to them getting to tell themselves what to do, maybe even telling their kids what to do. Ultimately, you can meet human needs with Jewish culture, and that's the essence of a humanistic Jewish community. The end. I'm happy to answer questions. I just want to let you know on the table, and I'll be here till about 3 o'clock or so. I've got an example of some of our books that our movements have published, an example of what a home Friday night Shabbat service might look like from a humanistic perspective. And this is a book that just came out this year from the Jewish Publication Society that I'm happy to sell if you want a copy, or if you like an ebook, you can just take a postcard to remind you to order that later. And I have my contact info here if anybody wants to be in touch after today. So with that, question, please.
Yeah, I have a good friend who's a humanist who has an assertion that humanism is appropriately deemed a religion. And the argument that my friend makes is that religion is a necessary and universal aspect of the human experience. And so humanism fills that niche, as it were, for people who are not persuaded by the supernatural. A counter argument that has been levied against that is that in our culture, when you say religion, even if you say it in the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court justices say it in a ruling, the implication is consistently Christian theism. And so the argument that you can carefully construct and explain a secular religion, but maybe it's best just not to use the term because it has so much baggage.
Sure. I've heard the quip that non-theism is a religion like off is a TV channel.
Yeah, right.
However, off is a TV viewing option, right? It's on the spectrum of what you can do with a TV. And so the Supreme Court legal case is actually fascinating because in, I think, the 1940s, there was a case about ethical culture. which is a movement that was started with ethics as the core of their religion. And they were not focused, it was about deed, not creed. That was one of their slogans. That it was not focused on supernaturalism, so a lot of secular people wound up there. And the question was, could an ethical culture community get a tax exemption based on religion? And the answer was yes, because they fit that piece of their members' lives, it met those needs. The dilemma is, if you read the dictionary, which I love how people cite the dictionary as if it's authoritative, universal, but it's written by people.
Yeah.
You know, it's not revealed either. But the first dictionary definition of religion is focused on supernaturals and gods and so on. But the third dictionary definition is a community of shared values and beliefs that provides meaning in people's life. So if you fit in dictionary definition number 3, but not number 1, that makes the most sense. And in the Jewish context in particular, Jewishness has always been more than just a religious belief in the Protestant categories of ritual practice and so on. It began as a national identity. You were Jewish because you were Judean. You were from Judea. That was the physical origin. It was a kingdom even. And then it was a theocracy under priests after the Babylonian exile. But there was always a sense of an ethno-religion there. It was a bit of both. That's why your definition of being Jewish is if you're born of a Jewish mother traditionally. It's not what you believe, it's not the rituals you practice, it's biology. And even to become Jewish, you acquired a new pedigree. You were a son of Abraham. So there was always this sort of ethnic piece to it. And I'll often use the example, is Adam Sandler or Amy Schumer Jewish? The answer is yes. Do they believe in God? The correct answer is, who knows? But the answer to number 2 doesn't affect the answer to number 1, because they're part of that peoplehood identity. So Jewishness has always been this complex of ethnic and cultural. So to have a cultural synagogue or a Jewish community that's organized along secular lines is maybe less of a stretch than some other religious traditions that are multi-ethnic. Think of Islam, and you could be Muslim from a lot of different ethnic backgrounds, or Christian and Korean and Nigerian. So the ethnicity is not as much of a core part of Christianity or Islam, but for Judaism it's always been sort of a little bit of both. Yeah.
How do you define, kind of along the same lines, but how do you define religious and observant?
Okay, so a lot of people in the Jewish world use this phrase observant, which means that you are practicing the traditional Jewish practices of dietary laws, of reciting prayers and blessings and so on, wearing certain clothing and head coverings, that kind of thing. That's what often people mean by observant, following the ritual practices. Where if you're a religious Jew, that's generally thought also as concerning belief. There's actually a really interesting book I haven't had a chance to read yet called How Judaism Became a Religion, which is about this framing of what Jewishness means over the centuries. And it's really only in the last few hundred years that people have thought of Judaism as just a religion, as opposed to just religion plus, this ethno-religious identity. So in my case, I'm observant of certain things. I do a Passover seder every year. I light Hanukkah candles every year. There are other things I'm not observant of. I don't follow dietary laws, as my chicken with feta cheese demonstrates. But that's that pick and choose approach, which you're allowed to do when it's a culture, when it's a core religious belief system that believes that the God of the universe cares what you eat. Then you have limits on what you can pick and choose from. So some people who come from a more orthodox or ultra-orthodox background don't understand this concept of picking and choosing. It's all or nothing. What's the point of this picking and choosing? Most people living in the liberal Jewish religious world, which is most Jews, by the way, 80% of American Jews don't keep kosher. Only about 20% do. And some only do it at home, but not out, so it's really not the majority at all. Most of them are living in that pick and choose world where they'll do certain things, but not other things, or they'll do it sometimes, but not other times. And that's, I would argue, more in the realm of culture than a core religious system where you have to do everything. Yes, please.
Why am I here?
Why are you here? Well, I can't give you one answer because there's no one purpose in life. People find a sense of purpose out of how they live their life and what they find most resonant and meaningful with their values, what they find most important. For some people, it's self-actualization, it's self-development. For other people, it's service to others and being part of a community. For some, it's connection with the natural world. We find that kind of inspiration and purpose in a lot of different ways, so I don't have one answer. I mean, the short answer being snarky is your parents produced, like genetics combined and then produced an ovum, they have an embryo and out you came. That's the how you got lunch.
You're
You're here for lunch. Yes.
You're a success story of 3.8 billion years of evolution.
There you go. You are the pinnacle of the universe. So that feels better. Any other comments or questions?
Alrighty,
All
thank
right,
you so
great.
much.
Good. Thank you. I'll be here till about 3 if you want to take a look at any of this material. Happy to. I do. If anyone is interested in the book version of my talk, I have a square to take credit cards if you want to, or cash.